This program is made possible by the loyal financial support of the friends and partners of Family Policy Institute.
You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world.
Good evening and welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. Tonight I speak to Ryan Smit of Cause for Justice, a human rights organization working to uphold our basic human rights like free speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of religion. I'm going to talk to him about what is happening in Parliament recently. There was a passing in Parliament of the amendment of the Civil Union Act, and that is quite a worrying thing that's happened, and Ryan is going to fill us in on what happened, the background, and the implications to that. So welcome, Ryan Smit. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you, Errol. I'm happy to be with you.
Okay, so Ryan, recently the Parliament passed the amendment to the Civil Union Act, and the National Council of Provinces did that as well. It is now obviously going to go to the president for signature, but it's a very, very worrying thing that has happened. You've been engaging with Parliament throughout this process. So if you could perhaps just tell us a little bit about the background of your interactions with Parliament.
Yes. So the bill initially was introduced by a private member, Deirdre Carter, when she was still an MP with the party COPE. And it was clear that she had been lobbied by some other group, a special interest group. So she brought this amendment, obviously, to remove the conscientious objection exemption from the Civil Union Amendment or the Civil Union Act. So the amendment has the effect that a marriage officer who works for the Department of Home Affairs will, going forward, if this legislation is passed by the president, such marriage officers will no longer be able to air a conscientious objection to solemnize a same-sex marriage, because this is the kind of reasonable accommodation that was included in our legislation when the Civil Union Act became law in 2006. It was basically an acknowledgement that flowed from the Constitutional Court's judgment in the case of Minister of Home Affairs versus Fourie and Bontes, the matter that legalized same-sex marriage in South Africa. But there was acknowledgement by the Constitutional Court that it's open to the state through legislation or other mechanisms to reasonably accommodate those marriage officers who work for the state who have a conscientious objection based on their sincere religious beliefs and convictions, that they would not be forced to solemnize a same-sex marriage that goes against their beliefs and against their own religion. So that's where the legislation came from back in 2018, I think it was introduced. So it went through the process in the National Assembly, through the Portfolio Committee, where we made submissions to the Portfolio Committee. The National Assembly passed the bill, and then it came over to the National Council of Provinces, where it has been for a while already, since the previous election, since May of 2019. Obviously, we know there was a break in the parliamentary program, and also with COVID, things have been slower. But in the last month or so, the progress has been very quick. They've really pushed and drove this through the Select Committee on Security and Justice. And so we again engaged in that process through written submissions. We've been asking both houses to please have some form of public hearings, public engagement over and above only receiving written submissions. In both houses, this request, which we were not the only party asking for it, but this request was denied. So the people of South Africa really hasn't even had an opportunity to directly engage their elected representatives. And as you said, the bill then went through the committee process, the Select Committee process, and then on the 1st of July, the National Council of Provinces in their plenary session, they then also passed the bill, which means that it now goes over to the presidency's office for him to consider the constitutionality to sign it or to not sign it.
Okay, so Ryan, just to help our viewers understand, you being an attorney, but just in layman's terms, what we're really dealing with here is that conscientious objectors, people that object on the basis of belief, religion, conscience, they can no longer do that. They are now compelled, these are state marriage officers, compelled by law to marry same-sex couples regardless of their beliefs, convictions, and conscience. Now, isn't, in the Constitution, there is protection for that, protection of your beliefs,
Sure.
of your conscience and beliefs. So how do they get around that?
So, Errol, that is a very good question, and this has been the basis of our engagement with Parliament. We have said to them, clearly what you have here is a situation where a couple, so a same-sex couple who want to have their marriage solemnized, and they want to do it at the Department of Home Affairs or with an ex officio marriage officer. That's on the one side. On the other hand, you have people who are employed by the state and work for the state as marriage officers. But these people, these employees, they don't forfeit their rights to freedom of conscience and religion and belief, which are theirs in terms of Section 15.1 of the Constitution. They still have those rights. So when we are dealing with this scenario of a potential conflict between these two groups, then there must be some or other weighing or balancing that must happen in order to determine how do we resolve this conflict or potential conflict. So when we look at the case of Minister of Home Affairs versus Fourie, the same-sex marriage case, the court was clear to say that if there is no prejudice, then it would be fine to acknowledge the rights of both parties and to reasonably accommodate your marriage officer who works for the state but who has a religious conviction, that is the basis for them to bring this conscientious objection. And so what we said to the department, or what we said to Parliament, it is possible to put in place a regime where you respect and you promote both groups' rights. And the suggestion we made to them is to say to keep the conscientious objection in place in the legislation, but add an additional clause to the Act, to the Civil Unions Act, that says the Department of Home Affairs must ensure that there is at each Home Affairs office a person, or how many people is required, that are not conscientious objectors, that are willing to solemnize same-sex marriages. But because in some areas in the country, it's mostly in rural areas, you do get the scenario where there is, in the Home Affairs office, there is not a person who is not a conscientious objector. In other words, there isn't a person there who's willing to solemnize a same-sex marriage. And now we say it's very clear that the reason why you have that prejudice happening is because there's some other fault or lack of planning within the department to ensure that the necessary people are available to do the job, to ensure that there is equal service delivery to all people who enter the Home Affairs office. It's very clear that the law is not the problem. Otherwise, it would be the same at every single Home Affairs office in the country. But that is not the case. So it must be a practical problem that must be solved with practical solutions.
Absolutely. And I think the easiest way out now is just to force everybody to officiate at same-sex weddings, whether they like it or not. But that is going to have constitutional implications. As you said, we're talking about a balance of constitutional rights here. And you can't take away or deny people their constitutional rights like conscience, belief, religious freedom, and all of that to give other people rights. And so I can see this actually heading to the Constitutional Court in one way or the other. But as an attorney also, Ryan, I wanted to ask you, do you think if the president signs this into law, this amendment, and state marriage officers are now compelled by law to perform same-sex marriages, whether they agree with it or not. Does this open the door then to move further and amend laws to force civil marriage officers, religious marriage officers, all marriage officers in the country to perform these same-sex marriages?
Yeah. Errol, let me first state this, that this change to the law does come with a transitional provision. The transitional provision is a 2-year, let's say it's introductory period, in which civil marriage officers will still be allowed to exercise their rights. But once the 24-month period has run its course, from that point on, the civil marriage officer will no longer have the right to conscientious objection. That is, of course, if the president does sign the bill. But then going over to your next question about religious marriage officers, they are not implicated by this legislation at all. And I think as things stand, and as the marriage legislation, taking into account the fact that we have a Marriage Act and we have a Civil Union Act, as things stand at the moment, there's no sort of risk or possibility that someone who is a religious marriage officer, who are employed by a religious institution, by a church or otherwise, will have any implications by virtue of this legislation. So that is something that is not on the table, and there's no risk there. One thing I will add that is really concerning, and I listened to something on Praat Saam on RSG this morning, and sadly, it is clear that this principle is under attack, not only in the field of marriage and the solemnization of marriage. It is also under attack in the field of medical practice, where there is very strong opinions out there that saying that if a person has a conscientious objection to doing an abortion, in other words, to terminate the life of an unborn baby on demand by a mother or a family or howsoever, they should not have the right to object to that. They should not have the right to say that I believe in the sanctity of human life from the moment of conception, and I do not want to be the person who ends this life, who basically kills this living human being. So it's very clear that the attack is not limited to what we're seeing now. And to come back to your question, I would not be surprised if at some point in the future we do get around to this issue. Whether someone who works for a church, or employed by a church as a pastor or a preacher or however, and who is a marriage officer in that capacity, will still have the right to object to the solemnization of same-sex marriage. I'm not putting that out of the scope. It is very possible.
Absolutely, because if you can see what's happening in Parliament now, it looks like it's all heading that way. And of course, the single marriage policy that the Department of Home Affairs is working on is also a big worry. I'm concerned, Ryan, by the lack of pushback from the church. The church hasn't spoken much into this issue, and maybe it's a discussion for another time. But Ryan, I want to thank you, Ryan Smit from Cause for Justice, for coming onto the program and just helping us understand this issue. Thank you, and God bless you in your work.
Thank you, Errol. Thank you so much.
Welcome back to the program. I'm speaking to Sharon Slater, the president of Family Watch International and the UN Family Rights Caucus. Now, Sharon Slater is a good friend of Arlene and I, and we meet all over the world at World Congress of Families events. Sharon, of course, is responsible for a number of breakthrough documentaries, helping people understand things like comprehensive sexuality education and all kinds of other issues. It's informative, and it gives people a view that they won't necessarily get anywhere else. So Sharon is performing a critical task for people of goodwill, for decent people that want to protect their children, want to protect marriage and families. Sharon Slater, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Errol. You and Arlene have been such great leaders throughout Africa and even at the United Nations in helping to protect children and the family. You're great partners. Thank you for having me on your show.
You're welcome. Always good to speak to you. So Sharon, we're talking about comprehensive sexuality education. So there's a big push. Well, there's comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE, that our National Department of Education is pushing here in South Africa. And then we have a further issue that we're contending with, and that's the Western Cape. This is the province I live in, where the local government, the provincial government, is pushing sexual orientation and gender identity in our public schooling system. We'll just refer to that as SOGI. Tell us a little bit what you know about SOGI.
Sure. Let's just start with the GI, the gender identity part of SOGI, because this is the most misunderstood component of the LGBT agenda. Gender identity is a radical ideology, and it teaches children that they may not be born male or female, that they could choose their gender. In fact, we've identified 112 genders. This is how crazy this agenda is. But what this does is, let's suppose a child is looking to identify as something. Children at adolescent age are always looking to create identities, and they're told by their sexuality education teacher that they may not be male or female, that they can choose their gender. And let's say they want to identify as the opposite sex. They may go to a Planned Parenthood clinic, because now they're offering gender hormones in a number of their clinics, which are very expensive. So you can imagine the pharmaceutical companies are wanting to get in part of this. They'll go to get these hormones. The children that go to get these hormones to get the appearance of the opposite gender, to change their voice, possibly to grow facial hair and so forth and so on, locks them into an identity that's not real, that's not their biological sex, leads them towards surgeries where they're actually going to amputate healthy body parts in an attempt to appear like the opposite sex. And what no one ever tells these youth is that they're going to be infertile for life. They're going to lose their ability to have children. This is probably the most horrendous, abusive agenda that's ever been perpetrated upon children. And we know and now have testimonies. We're producing a number of documentaries that will be coming forward of the stories of these poor children who have been, maimed through these surgeries. Their voices have changed, altered, that in permanent ways. And then they regret it. And then they try to go back and change their bodies back, and they can't, and they're stuck and they're suffering. This is child abuse at its worst. So to have your government want to teach children that they have a right to change their gender, that they may not be male or female, and confuse them about their very maleness and their femaleness, this is just wrong, and it must be stopped.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Sharon, because I think what is most dangerous about this is that our schooling system is taking this as a policy and introducing it into our schooling system. Now, this is there are children that struggle with sexual identity, but this is the parents' responsibility to deal with those issues. Parents could get counselors to help and walk their children through this thing. But once the school gets involved, once government gets involved through the public schooling system, and the policy actually says that it's to help affirm and celebrate sexual identity and sexual orientation and gender identity. So the school is going to affirm this and kind of make it a protected class and get all the other children to agree with this and kind of applaud it. It's crazy when you think about it. What have they done in the US when it came to the SOGI policy in schools?
I just got a text this very morning from a mother who just lost a court case here in my own state of Arizona. She just lost custody of her child because she refused to go along and affirm her child and get them surgery and hormones that would mutilate their bodies and so forth and so on. So it's becoming very dangerous that even some of our courts are adopting this insane, unscientific, harmful ideologies. Now, you asked at the beginning of this show, what can parents do about this? If your government is actually creating a policy where this could be promoted, I think parents need to stand up. There needs to be a policy at this school district or whatever level is pushing this curriculum where parents propose a new policy that says that sexual orientation or gender identity are topics that are so controversial that they are the purview of the parents, and these things shall not be taught in the schools. These actually need to be established as policies, otherwise the opposite will happen with your children.
Absolutely. So, so we've got the SOGI going into our Western Cape schools and comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE, going into our national schooling system. So at the moment, Sharon, they still they're doing trials in various schools in various provinces. They haven't fully implemented it, but UNESCO is driving this in South Africa. It doesn't come from South African citizens. They've not been consulted on this. Parents haven't been consulted. Educators haven't been consulted, because our government has signed an agreement with the United Nations, with UNESCO and UNFPA and UNICEF and the World Health Organization. They're driving this thing, and it's just going to be imposed on us. So we know what the agenda is. And again, on CSE, what can, from, as a global expert, can you tell our viewers what they should be doing and why they should be doing it?
Well, you mentioned this agreement that your government has signed on to implement comprehensive sexuality education with UNESCO, the World Health Organization. This agreement expires the end of this year. We need to let it expire and not let it be renewed. There needs to be a movement, a grassroots movement from parents all across South Africa. We're helping to support other organizations in other African countries to mobilize people against renewing that commitment. Right now, the UN agencies are pressuring South Africa to renew this until 2030. So parents need to be aware this is happening. They can also go to our website at stopcsc.org. They can arm themselves with information on how bad all these programs are if they click on the CSC exposed link, and then they can tell the government, make their voices heard, whether at the local level or at the regional level in your country or at the national level, and just say, we do not want CSE for our children. This is the purview of the parents. This is damaging. We do not want this agenda.
So Sharon, CSE has been introduced in our country by stealth. When our government signed on to it with the United Nations, I think it was in 2013, nobody knew about it. Our church leaders didn't know about it, the parents, the educators, and it's only because of your help. When I met you somewhere, you spoke about this issue, and I came back and did some investigation and found out that our government did indeed sign on to this thing without the knowledge of the public of South Africa. And we began doing work, getting it out, using your documentary that you produced, The War on Children. I put that on my TV programs, and I got that out in various methods, and that's how people got to know about this. So what do we do now if this renewal is coming up for another 10 years that our government needs to sign to renew their contract with the UN to push comprehensive sexuality education in our public school? What can we practically do to stop them to say we don't agree with it?
Well, when South Africa signed on, it was just either your health minister or your education minister just signed a piece of paper. It never went through your parliament. You should complain about that. That was, that bypassed your whole legislative system. How can just one minister sign on and commit your whole country to something so radical? So we need your constituencies, those who can hear my voice today, to contact their parliamentarians, to let them know. If you go to our website at familywatch.org and you click on our policy center, you can look for the ESA commitment. We have a whole brief on it that explains how manipulative it was, how they claimed CSE would do all these things, and then how they got all the governments to sign on that they were going to get CSE in 75% of their countries. Do you know what else is part of that agreement? That they're going to work to lower the age of sexual consent so that children can have sex with each other without having any legal consequences. I mean, there's more to this that's all spelled out in that brief. So people can educate themselves with that brief on the ESA commitment that's in our policy center at familywatch.org. And then start contacting parliamentarians, contact your Minister of Education, contact your Minister of Health, send emails to the President, raise the awareness that this is harmful to children. This is the purview of the parents. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that parents have a prior right to guide the education of their children. And this should be especially true in sexual matters. So parents need to claim this right and stop your government from signing on again to this CSE commitment for another 10 years. Also, parents need to go out in their communities, look in their schools, and find out if CSE is already there. You know, sometimes they do it through deceptive phone apps that children can get on. You know, we need to check our children's phones. Sometimes it's after school programs where they put them on these computers and they give them graphic sexual education that's very harmful. All of these things, parents need to be aware of what their children are already getting. Check out the curriculum in the schools or any community programs that your children are involved in.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, Sharon. Again, I want to thank you for the great work you're doing to help us all across the world. And you work with African nations across the continent, especially on this issue of CSE and this assault on our children. So Sharon, thank you for coming onto the program. I'm going to put your website details and all the other details on the screen so that our viewers can go to all the great resources you have to be informed so we can fight back against this thing. Thank you and God bless you.